to start with the new proposal to tax superannuation balances. How much is that policy designed to improve the budget position?
Senator James Kelly, First Assistant Secretary, Market Conduct and Digital Division. Before we answer the question, just flag that my Deputy Secretary, Brenton Philp, was intending to be here today, but for family reasons has been unable to do so, so I'll be holding his position. So I'll go to Ms Kelly.
Thanks. So the question is, how much new tax revenue will this measure deliver?
It's estimated to raise, as I understand it, 2.3. Is that the right one? Before I say that?
Yes, so that's...
Yeah.
So 2.3 billion is in the first full year of the operation of the tax, which is 27-28.
Yeah.
So in the forward estimates, it only comes into 1 year.
Yeah.
The last year of the estimates.
Correct.
Yeah.
And it's 2.3 billion a year.
When it's fully in operation, sorry, Adam Hawkins, Assistant Secretary, Tax and Transfers Branch. So when it's fully operating, it's estimated to raise just over $2 billion a year in revenue.
And is there any longer-term costing?
There's no costing beyond the forward estimates, but the rough annual amount expected to be raised in that first full year of operation, as I said, is just over $2 billion a year.
Okay. Is it in the IGR, in the intergenerational report?
So in the IGR, we take a very much a top-down approach in estimating the cost of the tax concessions that accrue to superannuation.
Yeah.
And so we look at the entire policy environment and assessing the extent of those concessions.
Yeah, so is it in or out?
So it's part of the policy settings.
It's in?
Yes.
It's in. Okay. And 2.3 bill a year in its first full year of operation, how much of that is coming from defined contribution and how much from defined benefit?
So we don't have a separate estimate for either type of scheme.
So how have you costed it then?
No, as I said, the approach to costing these looks at the whole of the system level. And so we do have an estimate in terms of the number of individuals from a defined benefit and defined contribution. But the tax is calculated as the earnings across everyone's superannuation interests. So you might have an individual who has both defined contribution and defined benefit, and their earnings are calculated on the movement on both of those interests. So we don't, for the purpose of costing, we don't separate out those two types of interests. However, we do have estimates for how many individuals hold either type.
So how many people within defined benefit environment will be hit with this new tax?
So we estimate that about 10,000 individuals have defined benefit interests. Will be
10,000.
Yes.
And how many of them are living in Canberra?
We haven't done any analysis.
Well, how many of them do you think would be former public servants?
No, we haven't done any analysis.
Don't know.
We haven't done any analysis on the individuals who hold those interests. It's not necessary to do that. Don't take the costing.
Okay. So the bill itself doesn't deal with defined benefit, does it?
Oh, no, I'm not sure I'd agree with that. The bill provides for
certain people.
Well, the bill provides for the process by which you calculate the tax in total. However, the way for valuing defined benefit interests, which are important to calculate someone's total superannuation balance at both the start and the end of the year, which are the two reference points by which earnings are calculated, requires a valuation for defined benefit interests, and because those valuations will have to differ depending on the structure of those benefit arrangements, they're set out in regulations.
Okay, so the regulations will make the final rules, won't they, for the retired politicians and for the serving politicians like the Prime Minister, Mr Albanese, won't they?
Well, it sets out the approach to valuing those types of interests.
Who makes those regulations?
Well, those regulations are made under the legislation.
But which minister makes them?
Well, they're within the Treasury portfolio.
Yeah, so, which Treasury minister makes the regs? Pretty important question.
Well, the Treasurer is responsible for tax matters such as this.
Okay, so the Treasurer makes the regulations, not the Assistant Treasurer.
Well, I mean, both ministers work together across the parliament. So, I mean, I can't speak to who might be responsible within the parliament.
Okay, so either the Treasurer or the Assistant Treasurer can make the regulations on the final rules for the tax scheme that will apply to people like Mr Albanese and Brendan O'Connor and Senator Wong.
Got any on your side on the good scheme?
We're not making the rules. You've exempted
No, I know,
yourself.
but
you've
presumably
exempted your
there'll be
colleagues.
people across the
You've
parliament.
exempted your colleagues from the main bill.
Well, that's
And
not
you
true.
put it in the regs. It's a huge conflict of interest. Anyway, so either minister can make the regs. Is that right?
Why is it a conflict of interest?
Because-
To impose a higher
Because
tax
Stephen
rate.
Jones could be making the regs for his boss, Mr Albanese. So who makes the regs? Either Treasury Minister.
The regulations would be made in the normal way for regulations, made under the legislation
Do you
and
want to take it on notice?
moved in the parliament and could be disallowed within a period of 14 days, as is the case for any other.
Sounds like you
type
want
of-
to take it on notice. You're not sure which minister
Senator
can.
Bragg, come on.
Well, I'm not sure
He's
he
answered
knows
the
the
question.
answer. Who makes
It's
the
in the
regulation?
Treasury
It's
portfolio.
it's an
The
important
Treasury
question.
ministers can make the regulation.
So it's either minister.
If we need to correct that, we will, Senator Bragg.
Okay, so we'll take it that either minister can do it, either Dr Chalmers or Mr Jones.
If we have more information, we will provide it with
Can
you.
Dr Lee make the regs?
Well, I think it's usual practice for ministers within the one portfolio to determine who's going to take decisions on things like making of regulations.
It could be any of those three people to make these regs.
Well, as I said, it's a matter for the ministers to determine who's going to take the decisions on particular policy issues.
Okay. What representations have been made to Treasury about the final formulation of these regulations, which you have in a draft form? Who has made representations? Have you had representations from retired judges, retired politicians, retired public servants?
So we have undertaken a consultation process on the draft regulations, as you've noted, and we've received a significant number of submissions to that process, including from a number of the groups you just outlined, including but particularly groups that represent former judges.
What's their argument to you?
Well, I guess the case that's been put by judicial officers has been that, there's several arguments, in fact, put to us from that particular group. One which is to the extent that that might influence the independence of the judiciary, to the extent that that might compromise the remuneration arrangements that they'd had offered to them at the time they took up their position, and to the extent that it overlaps with the current tax arrangements that they face.
And what is the advice that you're giving government about that?
Well, we're working through the feedback we received in consultation, and we will provide advice to government about those issues.
So you haven't made a judgment about whether the tax will apply to former judges?
Well, that's the intention. We want the policy to apply equitably across various schemes.
And you can give an assurance that it will apply to the Prime Minister and other members of the Cabinet?
Well, that's the intention, Senator Bragg.
Right. And when will those regs be made?
Lynn Kelly, First Assistant Secretary, Retirement Advice Investment Division. It is customary first for the legislation to be passed.
Yep.
Subsequent to the legislation being passed, that is when you would expect regulations to be made. So I can't give a time frame until the legislation is passed.
So do
Help
your
us pass it.
so do your
You can answer that.
do your does your draft reg in your mind, does that establish equitable treatment across those classes of people, former politicians, former public servants, former judges?
So the regulation and overarching legislation is framed to apply as broadly as possible within constitutional limits. It's designed to ensure commensurate treatment between all superannuation interests, including defined benefit and defined contribution schemes.
Okay, so the current position is it will apply to all those groups?
To the extent permitted by the Constitution, yes.
Okay. That is, and you don't know when you'll be making the regs though?
Well, the legislation's got to pass. And we've got a bit of a block happening in the name of the opposition for a change.
Okay.
He says no to everything.
Okay. So you come back on, will you take that on notice? Who's going to make the regs or not?
Well,
You're going to stand by your answer before.
Yes,
It
I
could be
am.
any Treasury Minister.
well, the regs haven't been drafted yet.
Doesn't matter. It's not a
So
hypothetical.
it's in the Treasury
not a
portfolio.
hypothetical.
It'll be a Treasury Minister,
Any Treasury Minister, okay?
Senator Bragg, and I would urge you to pass the legislation so we can get to that stage.
Good to know.
I have more, sir.